Hello, I want to talk a little bit today about activity-based costing and a couple of other methods of costing, including plant-wide rates and departmental rates as well. So let me go ahead and share the screen. Now, let's start with the plant-wide rate. Now, a plant-wide rate is probably the easiest rate. Um, I think its probably biggest advantage is its simplicity. The formula would basically just be budgeted overhead cost divided by a budgeted allocation base. And the allocation base is usually direct labor hours, machine hours, or direct labor cost. So if you're doing a plant-wide rate, you would just apply this same rate to all of the products you make, all of the jobs that you're working on, the products you make, you would apply basically the same rate to it. So basically, in this case, if your budgeted overhead cost was 2 million and your budgeted direct labor hours was 100,000, you would just take the 2 million divided by the 100,000, and you would get a plant-wide rate of $20 per direct labor hour. So for every direct labor hour that you worked on a job or worked on a product, you would apply $20 of overhead for it. So if job number 101 uses 55 direct labor hours, then the factory overhead charge to that job would be what, 55 times the rate of $20 an hour here we looked at, $1,100 of overhead would be charged to that job. So again, a plant-wide rate, its advantage would be its simplicity. And you would basically have one rate that used for everything in the plant, the products, the jobs, the different things that they were doing. Now, the problem with a plant-wide rate, though, is that sometimes it kind of spreads things evenly when certain products maybe should have more or less overhead applied to them. So although it's a very simplistic approach, it's not good if you have multiple products that are very different in nature that really should be things applied to them a little differently. It could lead to over allocating overhead to some products and under allocating overhead to other products. So very simplistic. Now it would work well if you only had one, if you were making only one product in one location, this would be fine. This is all you would ever need. But if you have multiple products in one location, going with just a plant-wide rate can cause some issues of not accurately allocating overhead, maybe as accurately as it should be allocated. Now, you can also use departmental overhead rates. And basically departmental rates, you come up with a rate that best fits each department where your product is produced. Different allocation based may be used for each department. And this is really good. This is a little bit better and a little bit more accurate than a plant-wide rate. Because think about it this way, you might have one department over here that uses a lot of automation, a lot of machines. So you'd be best to apply machine hours to it. And you might have another department over here that uses a lot of manual labor. So you would be better to apply like direct labor hours to it. So what this allows you to do is come up with, okay, what's the best rate for each department? And based on how much each product, uses, or how much of each job or product in that uses of that department as it's being made, as it's going through, then you basically would then charge overhead based on what's really more accurate for that department. So, think about it this way, like here's an example. Now the formula would be the same as the plant-wide rate, which would be the budgeted overhead cost divided by the budgeted allocation base. But again, you might have a different allocation base for each department. So let's say we have a machining department and our budgeted overhead costs for that department are $1 million. But for the allocation base for this one, it's mainly machines. It's mainly automation. So we're going to use machine hours because that's a better measure for that department. And so we estimate 25,000 machine hours. And so our machining department rate would be $40 per machine hour. We would simply take the budgeted overhead cost, we would divide it by the allocation base, in this case, machine hours, and we would get $40 per machine hour for the product based on when it was going through the machining department. Then we would go to the assembly department, and the assembly department budgeted overhead cost would be 600,000. And for the assembly department, the allocation base is going to be direct labor hours. And so the assembly department rate would be $30 per direct labor hour. We would just take the 600,000, we'd divide it by the 20,000 direct labor hours, and we'd come up with a rate per direct labor hour. So if we were doing this for job number 101, then basically we would take, let's say the machining department, it took 60 hours. So we'd take 60 hours times our rate, which was what, $40 an hour. We'd come up with 2,400. And then through the assembly department, let's say it took 50 direct labor hours to get through the assembly department. We would take that 50 direct labor hours times our rate of $30 an hour, and we'd charge 1,500 of overhead from the assembly department. We'd add those two together, and the total overhead charge to that job would be $3,900. Now, you could really come up with a rate for each department. So if your product went through 7 departments, you could have a rate for each department, and basically you could, based on how much of that rate it used as it went through each department, you could charge it overhead based on that. In this example, I just did 2. Most companies probably have 2, 3, 4, different departments that a product goes to as it's being made. Just remember that with departmental rates, you come up with the department rate for each department. You come up with a rate of allocation of overhead for each department, and you just apply it as it goes through the departments based on how much of that allocation base that the product uses. And that would be a way you would charge overhead. Now, the good thing is, in most cases, the departmental rates, it's a little bit more accurate than the plant-wide rates, because it applies it based in different departments. And kind of as we looked at earlier, it's hard to come up with one plant-wide rate, one allocation base that's sufficient for the plant, because some areas might be more manual labor, some areas might be more machine operated, more automation. And so it's hard to come up with just one that works effectively for the whole plant. So by doing departmental rates, you're able to break it down by department as to what allocation based is best for each department. Okay, so the last one we're going to look at is ABC, activity-based costing. And there's kind of 3 steps when you're doing ABC. And that is, you're going to identify activities and budgeted costs related to the production of a product. So you kind of want to study a product, and you want to find, okay, what activities take place in making this product, and what kind of identifies the cost, or what identifies with the cost, or what costs are related to those activities that go into producing the product. You want to compute an overhead rate for each of these activities, and you want to allocate overhead to the products based on their use of the activities. So the benefits of ABC are it's more accurate than any other methods. It will give you a more accurate product cost based on allocating overhead than any other method. And kind of here's the big picture. Remember, when you're producing a product, remember that there's 3 elements of product cost. You've got direct materials, you've got direct labor, and you have factory overhead. And remember that direct materials and direct labor typically are pretty easy to charge to a product. As you add materials, you add the cost of those materials to the products. As the individuals that are putting the product together put it together, you charge the labor that they're incurring to the product. So those parts are typically pretty easy to follow, pretty easy to see. The problem comes with overhead. Since overhead is really just an indirect cost, it's a challenge sometimes to find, okay, what are the most accurate methods and ways to allocate overhead to the final product? And basically, ABC helps you do that. So probably the biggest benefit with ABC is it's more accurate than other methods, the plant-wide and the departmental rates that we just looked at. It is more accurate than those. And also, I think a benefit of ABC is that you learn a lot about your cost. You learn about what causes cost. And by learning more about your cost, I think a company is better able to make changes or lower cost as they understand what causes their cost. So I do think it's helpful from that extent as well. Now, the cost of ABC, probably the biggest thing is it's more costly to establish and maintain. Typically, when a company is setting up ABC, they a lot of times have to bring in outside experts to work with their production engineers, their production managers, their team at the plant. And typically it takes a lot of money and a lot of time to establish. And also, anytime that you change something, like you change your product or you change something with what you do, you've really kind of got to revisit ABC to make sure that it's still accurate, that you're allocating cost still in an accurate manner. So I think the challenge sometimes with ABC is that the cost. And for some companies, they would really kind of have to examine, is it worth the additional cost? Yes, it is better. It is more accurate, but is it worth the additional cost? And again, there's cost to initially establish it and greater time and cost to maintain it as well and to update it regularly as well. Now, how activity-based costing works is first thing you want to do is you're going to come up with activity rates. And the activity rates are simply your budgeted activity cost divided by your budgeted activity usage. And I've kind of got a little chart kind of laid out here, and I'm listing some activities such as production activities, and overhead would be applied based on direct labor hours. That would kind of be your activity that would cause the overhead cost. Setups, and it would be just the number of setups. Setup would mean that, like, when you move one product through, you have to change or clean the machine for the next product to come through. And if you have to do this a number of times, then it does create cost. And remember that when you're doing activity-based costing, you're looking at what activities create the cost of making the product. And you want to identify and kind of make more of these activities more like a direct cost related directly to the production of that product. And in doing so, you get a much more accurate way to allocate overhead costs to the products that are being produced. Now, another one here is design. And design, this would be like every time you design a new product or have to make changes, or I've noticed the different models. There is a design cost related to that. So if you've got 10 different models, you've had to design each one of them, and there's a cost related to that. And so if you have design cost, this would be just the number of design changes. And then factory services, this would be things like utilities and insurance. And typically this is done based on the square footage. So if you've got a machining area over here and they have a certain amount of square footage, then you would charge them a lot of your general plant cost would be charged to that area based on the amount of square footage that that area takes up. So things like utilities, insurance, maintenance, a lot of those issues, a lot of times would be kind of more generally charged to an area based on their square footage or their size of that area. So we've come up with the activities and what basically is related to those activities. We've got then a budgeted cost, and what we would do then, budgeted activity usage. So budgeted cost, budgeted activity usage. So this would be what, 20,000 direct labor hours. So we would take the 400,000, we would divide it by the 20,000 budgeted direct labor hours, and we would get an activity rate of $20 per direct labor hour. For setups, we've got $200,000 cost assigned budgeted to it. We anticipate 1,000 different setups. And so we would come up with an activity rate of $200 per setup. And for design, number of design changes. The cost for designs, 800,000. The number of design changes would be 10. So we've got a rate of 80,000 per design change. And then for factory services, we're going to use square foot. So we have $500,000 budgeted. We've got 100,000 square foot in the factory. So we're going to charge it to the different areas based on $5 per square foot. So let's go through basically job number 101 here. The production, let's say it took 5,000 direct labor hours. 5,000 times the rate of $20 an hour would give us $100,000 of overhead charged to that job based on production. And then setups, 50 setups occurred. So we would take 50 times the rate of $200 per setup, and $10,000 is going to be charged to it based on setups. Let's say there's one design change. So 1 times 80,000 per design change, going to be $80,000 assigned to it. And factory services, let's say that it was made, this job was completed within 5,000 square foot area. So we'd take that 5,000 times $5 a square foot, and 25,000 would be assigned to it. So our total overhead applied to job 101 would be adding all of these up, and it would be $215,000. So when you're doing ABC, you want to find activities, and typically most companies find about 3 to 7 different activities. We found 4 here. You want to then locate something that is related to that activity, or a way to measure that activity. So like with production, direct labor hours, setup, number of setups, design, number of design changes, factory services, square footage. And so then you come up with a budgeted cost for each of those activities, and a budgeted or anticipated activity level for those activities. And then you come up with an activity rate. And then you apply it to your jobs or products based on how much of these activities that they use. And that would be how you would determine the total amount of overhead applied to that product or that job. And so like in this case here, now if we wanted to break it down on a per unit basis, we would simply take this total overhead cost, divide it by the number of units that were part of that job, and we would get that we charged overhead at the rate of $2.15 per unit. That would be our per unit overhead cost. Now, one thing I did want to mention real quickly too, also about ABC, is that ABC, the example that we looked at here is mainly related to manufacturing. And the example we looked at with a plant-wide departmental rate mainly related to manufacturing a product. But in the real world, ABC is often used by healthcare and service companies. And basically any company that has a lot of overhead could adapt ABC as a way to better allocate the overhead to what they do. So think about it this way. If you're a healthcare, like if you're a hospital, you are going to allocate the cost of overhead to your patients. The cost of all the machinery you've got and the equipment and everything you've got, you're going to end up allocating a little of that to your patients, the cost of your patients. Service companies would do the same thing. A company like Federal Express would allocate some of the cost of delivering their packages to the cost of their planes, and all of their overhead costs would end up being allocated to their delivery cost. And so again, ABC can be adapted to be used by other industries outside of manufacturing, especially in healthcare and service companies today. Okay, so thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed our discussion of ABC.